this videocast from Australian Community Futures Planning on the State of Australia in 2020. I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of ACFP, and this series covers the facts about the health and well-being of Australia's society, environment, economy and democracy. The issues listed here are among the most important for Australia to solve before 2030. Failure to make substantial progress on these issues in the coming decade will make it harder and far more costly for Australians to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security. Australian Community Futures Planning is working with Australians to develop a plan to overcome the challenging issues raised in this series. That plan is called Australia Together. This is Australia's first National Community Futures Plan. It is being developed by Australians for Australians and is designed to increase our chances of arriving safely at our preferred future by 2050 or sooner. Factual details and data presented in this series provide the starting points for Australia Together. They pinpoint some of our biggest weaknesses as a nation in 2020. As such, they form the basis for some of the most ambitious targets that Australians can draft into their first National Community Futures Plan. The full set of 7 videocasts on the State of Australia in 2020 covers facts about our nation's health and well-being in 20 critical areas of our society, environment, economy and democracy. This episode covers issue number 6 on our nation's outmoded and failing constitution, issue 7 on the loss of rights that all Australians have suffered in the past 2 decades, and issue 8 on our declining participation in democracy. You can pause this video at any time to consider the points and statistics provided. For the remaining episodes in the State of Australia in 2020, visit the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. Australia's constitution is the product of 19th century thinking for a distant land. It is singularly ill-suited for a 21st century Australian democracy. The constitution acknowledges and provides for the people, but only insofar as they may elect representatives, not insofar as they might play a more influential role in a participatory democracy. And it ignores our First Nations and their custodianship of this land for over 60,000 years before the arrival of Europeans. This particular failing in our constitution is hampering Australia in its ability to come to terms with the difficult truth of our origin as a nation, acknowledge the impact of this on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and move forward as a reconciled nation according equal dignity to all. The fact is that as far as our constitution goes, our Indigenes do not exist. They rate no mention whatsoever in our nation's birth certificate. This explains why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are now asking for a voice in the constitution, and it is an indictment of Australians that in the 21st century we are still mired in a debate which we should have settled decades ago. This debate continues in part because we have not articulated values that accord equal rights to all. We may take it for granted that we all have these rights, but in truth, none of us do. Except for the protection of a right to freedom of religion, Australia's constitution confers no explicit human rights on either Indigenes or non-Indigenes as individuals. For as long as we have a constitution that does not set out what we stand for as a nation, human rights for all Australians, not just our Indigenes, are at risk. As in 2020, Australians do not have explicitly conferred rights to freedom of speech, peaceful assembly and protest, or freedom of the press in our constitution. Nor do we have rights to trial in open court, and rights to freedom from unlawful detention are disappearing. Australians might assume that the Constitution implies they have a right to freedom of political communication, but several recent High Court decisions have exposed the truth that this right applies only in very limited circumstances and is not a right conferred on Australians as individuals. Some human rights have been conferred in legislation in some states, but they can be overturned at any time. Some legislated rights are being actively extinguished because there is nothing in our Constitution which ensures that those rights cannot be extinguished. In my recent book, By 2050, I set out the facts of how these rights have been substantially eroded over the last 2 decades. We are moving steadily towards autocracy and away from the freedoms we have hitherto taken for granted. Australia's Constitution has its strength in that it enshrines democracy for Australians, albeit a limited representative democracy. But at the same time, it is standing in the way of our growth to maturity as a modern nation with clear values and a coherent agreement on decency. 120 years after we, or rather our distant Victorian age sovereign, first defined how we were to govern ourselves, we still have not defined to what end we want to govern ourselves and how we might fairly make our nation together. The Constitution should go to the heart of our national identity. At present, it and we are silent on that topic. We are silent on what we stand for. And being so silent, we are exposed to all manner of risk and societal breakdown. That breakdown can be avoided if we work together to define our democracy, what it is for, and what we want to stand for as a nation for our next century. At the moment, however, in the year 2020, Australia is in a state of stagnation or even atrophy in relation to the very thing that could, if we set it up well, speed us safely to our preferred future. The Constitution, the thing which federates our states and territories into a union, does not look forward to how we may remain a union, let alone the union of equals that we might expect when we think about our nation and take for granted that it is a democracy. The small number of debates we have had over the Constitution in the post-war period have mainly centred on whether we want to cling to a distant monarchy or newly identify ourselves as a republic. These debates assume we will attain maturity as a nation if we become a republic. But to mature as a nation, we actually have to decide what we want to stand for as a nation, what we value in forming our particular union. That has less to do with whether we become a republic or not than it has to do with what is actually in the Constitution about our rights and our values. Until we establish these things, we have no sense of ourselves as a modern nation or what it means to be Australian. We also have no sense of what we are really defending whenever we're asked to sacrifice our children in defence of our realm. The urgency to decide on what we really value, what we are truly drawn together by, is serious. It is serious because the rights and values we might assume are a given somewhere in our democracy are actually being taken away. The democracy that we can use to set down our desired national character is itself slowly being eroded from both above in changes of law and from below by our own withdrawal from democratic participation. The next 2 parts of this episode show how serious this is becoming. If we want a healthy democracy, we will need to make a fresh start in our Constitution. Otherwise, Australians simply will not be able to use their democracy for all it is worth. A Constitution which lifts we the people from a passive player on the sidelines to an active and respected partner in our own governance is a vital prerequisite for our future as a nation. We won't be able to develop that Constitution unless we understand our rights. That is why the next issue, Issue 7, looks at the threats to those rights. the September 11 attacks on America in 2001, Australia's Parliament has responded by legislating to reduce rights for Australians. This program of attenuation of our rights has proceeded apace under the guise of national security. These are rights we've taken largely for granted, even though they have never actually been conferred on us or guaranteed by our Constitution. Under these legislative and other administrative changes, we've experienced reductions in freedom of the press, alongside a failure to protect democratic discourse from misinformation, fake news, and hate speech. We've also experienced reduction of transparency in government and access to public information, inequitable application of electoral funding rules, and a lack of transparency in lobbying, suppression of free speech, protest, and the right to organise, and significant reduction of human rights for Australians, not simply for refugees. If Australians have felt safe since Federation that we are a free and open nation, they can no longer really take this for granted. Reductions on freedom of the press include, but are not limited to, raids on journalists' homes and files and attempted seizure of material which would disclose journalists' sources, intimidation of journalists via criminalisation of public interest journalism, prohibition of reporting on human rights abuses in offshore detention centres, vesting of power in politicians instead of justice officials to sign off on prosecutions of journalists, and severe funding cuts to the ABC and threats to its independence, cuts totalling more than $780 million since 2014. Viewers will find a consolidated compendium of the sources of these facts about loss of rights in Chapter 8 of By 2050. For more information on the cuts to the ABC, viewers may wish to view Episode 4 in this series on the State of Australia in 2020. But the clampdown on journalistic freedoms is just the start of the story. At the same time, we're experiencing reductions of transparency in government and access to public information. Examples of this include increases in refusals of Freedom of Information applications, or FOI applications, by the federal government and federal ministers. Extensive delays in the time taken to respond to FOI applications, sometimes for the full length of a minister's occupation of a portfolio, and subsequent refusals to consider FOI requests after, and merely because, the minister has left the portfolio. The FOI system at the federal level is now simply broken. Added to that, we have reduction of funding for the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, and more frequently these days, whenever the government doesn't warm to the findings of independent auditors general about its behaviour, we see them commissioning alternative reports on potential ethics breaches by ministers, such as in the sports fraud scandal of 2019, and then refusing to disclose the findings of those alternative inquiries into their own potential corruption. And to build the wall more solidly between Australians and their governments, we've suffered tenacious and continuing resistance to the establishment of a fully open national corruption watchdog. We've also had to suffer suppression of the public's right to know through serious intimidation of whistleblowers who disclose matters of government conduct and potential misconduct, knowledge of which is clearly in the public interest. Intimidation of whistleblowers is becoming a particular concern. Prison terms now apply for whistleblowers who make public interest disclosures of classified information on immigration and border enforcement matters. Legislation now deems any and all such disclosures reckless before the fact, merely because the information being disclosed has been given a security classification. And since just about everything can have a security classification, this means that almost nothing can be disclosed, no matter how much it may be in the public interest to know about it. In the event of charges being laid against whistleblowers or journalists in relation to disclosures, no onus exists on the government to prove that the disclosure was reckless or was contrary to the public interest, and a defendant cannot plead public interest as a defence. This legislation effectively makes it impossible for any public interest disclosure at all in the area of immigration, national security, and the operation of the Australian Border Force. In short, in these areas, disclosures of illegal or harmful conduct by the government or security forces are now effectively impossible. There is now no mechanism by which Australians can be advised when the government is secretly acting contrary to the public interest in these areas. Journalists can even be imprisoned if they inadvertently reveal something about an operation that is classified as a special intelligence operation. On top of all this, Australia is experiencing growth in inequitable application of election funding rules and a lack of transparency in lobbying. Lobby groups and rich individuals are allowed to buy elections, such as Clive Palmer, who paid $83 million in 2019 to sway preferences towards the coalition, and Malcolm Turnbull, who paid almost $2 million in person to boost the coalition's electoral campaign in 2016. And yet, the coalition government attempted to introduce legislation in 2018 which would restrict small donations by householders to activist groups like Get Up and charities like the Climate Council. In other words, all the legislative actions of the coalition government since 2014 have been aimed at capping the small donations of the many, not the massive donations of the few. There has also been an arguable misuse of Commonwealth powers under the Constitution by the coalition government in its provision of grants direct to local communities instead of via the states. For example, grants provided by the Morrison government direct to sporting clubs in the 2019 federal election campaign, largely in contradiction of the rules for grants and the recommendations of Sports Australia. This amounted to an unashamed, dubious misuse of powers under the Constitution during a pre-election caretaker period for nothing more than purposes of electoral funding distortion. There is also now an excessive concentration of the powerful influence of certain lobby groups, particularly those employing recently retired government ministers and those associated with mining and fossil fuels. The recent formation of the National COVID-19 Commission, the NCC, and its associated committees, largely filled with people from big business and the fossil fuel industry, is a major concern in this regard. The federal government has determined that members of the Commission do not have to declare their interests publicly, which means we can never really know whether they acted for or against the national interest. But they will have acted against it if they use their inside influence to secure taxpayer funding for private fossil fuel ventures. For more information on the extent of the adverse impact on our environment, economy, and democracy arising from the perversion of our democracy that is the NCC, viewers may view Episode 6, Part 2, on climate change. Up to 2020, the situation with transparency in lobbying was bad enough in that while registers were kept and were generally, although not easily accessible, they were rarely kept up to date and in many cases simply existed in dispersed locations in paper form, much of which is handwritten and illegible. Journalists found that the deeper they dug into these registers, the bigger the holes. In pecuniary interests and gift registers, categories are missing, disclosures are illegible, and guidance is scant. Finally, journalists at Guardian Australia had to assemble various registers themselves to make them accessible. In other words, a privately funded transparency project had to be established to clean up the mess wherever possible. Australians can now only see into the declarations that are made in things like pecuniary interests and lobbying because of modules recently made accessible to all Australians for free under Guardian Australia's Citizens Hub Transparency Project. This is a group of Australians patiently digitising paper records. However, in 2020, the situation with regard to transparency of democratic decisions has continued to deteriorate. The register of interests of those in the National COVID-19 Commission, the most influential people over the nation's future, People who have not been democratically elected or even appointed on merit through competitive advertising, their register of interest is not accessible at all. And yet, they're on the public payroll for hundreds of thousands of dollars each. There is no possible justification for the lack of transparency Australia is currently suffering due to the federal government's insistence that the most powerful lobbyists in the land should attain such inordinate influence without scrutiny. It would be different if the members of the NCC were required to recuse themselves from discussions when they have a conflict of interest, but they are not required to do this and do not do it. And to compound the anomaly, while the government is intent on ensuring that Australians will not be able to look into the private interests of NCC members, that same government is intruding into the private lives of citizens more and more every year. That intrusion has crept forward with the introduction of laws in 2015 requiring phone and internet providers to store metadata of all subscribers. These are data sets recording where citizens browsed the internet, who they called or emailed, and who called and emailed them, when and for how long. These laws, if properly administered, can help protect Australians from terrorism. But they have also provided a platform on which abuses of power can be and are being more easily mounted. The metadata can be and is being misused by surveillance and policing agencies for the purpose of forming what is called a reasonable suspicion that a person has committed an offence, even though the actual content of calls and internet browsing are not necessarily being stored and are not supposed to be accessible by security agencies. Based on said reasonable suspicion, formed with no evidence other than a log of the time and duration of a call or email, a person can be raided, detained without charge, provided with no information of the nature of any offence, and is unable to complain because it is a criminal offence to disclose information relating to a special intelligence operation, even when it's impossible to know that the offence might relate to a special intelligence operation. For any poor, unlucky Australian caught in this, it's a surreal, Orwellian nightmare. Some of this might be comforting for national security reasons, were it not for the fact that there is evidence of these powers being misused and poorly administered, particularly in conjunction with new anti-terrorism laws, which significantly erode the rights of Australians without sufficient accountability and safeguards being in place to prevent abuse of the extra powers granted under these laws. Over 70 pieces of legislation have been passed since 2002, which introduce or increase powers of police to hold people in police custody without charge, powers of surveillance and interrogation of non-suspects, powers of monitoring non-suspects' computers, powers of coercion in testimony, secret warrants and secret evidence, warrantless search powers for persons and homes, immunity from civil and criminal prosecution for ASIO officers in covert special intelligence operations, except in cases of torture, murder and rape, and powers to jail journalists who inadvertently reveal ASIO special intelligence operations. This is heavy-handed stuff for what we might have thought was a free and open democracy capable of demonstrating ethical behaviour to Australians and to other nations. ASIO officers operating covertly are safe from prosecution for fraud, theft, coercion, violation of privacy laws, and almost any other breach of law outside torture, murder and rape, if the illegal action occurred in association with a special intelligence operation. The illegal behaviour doesn't even have to be in the public interest. It's an abuse waiting to happen because there is no requirement to account for any abuse. We have created a class of people who are above the law, but at the same time we have diminished the rights of all other Australians under the law. Equality before the law in Australia is declining. Australians already have evidence that these new laws are in full play in Australia today in a manner that is not in their interests. Secret trials have been held, and more cases are emerging where the government is prosecuting people for ostensible security offences in closed courts without having to demonstrate that secrecy is in the national interest and that they are doing anything more than covering up conduct that is merely embarrassing to the government or covering up outright illegal misconduct. This has removed almost all restraints on illegal or unethical behaviour by intelligence officials, such as behaviour that has been obvious in the widely acknowledged event of Australia's bugging in 2004 of the cabinet meetings of the Timor-Leste government during negotiations on oil rights, and the revelation that in 2018 the government sought to use the Australian Signals Directorate to spy on Australians without a warrant and access their personal and financial data without their knowledge. It is clearly in the public interest for Australia to know these things, but the current Conservative federal government is clamping down on the meagre rights we have assumed in this regard. Overall, the rights of ordinary Australians to free speech, freedom to organise, freedom of association and freedom to protest have been slowly suppressed over the decades to 2020. Examples of this abound. They include repeated campaigns to silence over 1 million engaged citizens in GetUp, repeated attacks on trade unionism through work choices under the Howard government, which failed, but then again through the Ensuring Integrity Bill 2019, which seeks to deregister unions for the slightest breach, like not submitting an annual report on time. They also include increased prohibitions on and penalties for peaceful civil protest. These are laws which threaten peaceful protesters with jail sentences of up to 10 years, and in some cases have the effect of redefining entirely peaceful, non-destructive protest, even on public land, as espionage, with penalties of up to 25 years imprisonment. Other examples include threats to legislate against the rights of Australians to boycott businesses on environmental and ethical grounds, development of legislation to legalise discrimination on the grounds of religion in employment and service provision, and repeated attempts to repeal Sections 18C and 18D of the Racial Discrimination Act. We are also experiencing removal of the presumption of innocence until guilt is proven for recipients of welfare, and a foisting of the onus of proof onto those recipients in cases where Centrelink, without evidence, has served them with notice of a debt for overpayments they may or may not have received, a Centrelink procedure which has since been found to be entirely unlawful and destructive. We're experiencing concentration of power in one minister rather than the courts as to who shall be allowed to stay in Australia and who shall not. We're experiencing forced deportation of Indigenous Australians who have committed a crime and served their time, or who have not committed a crime and have even served in the National Forces, but who may not be able to prove citizenship. We're experiencing effective withdrawal from or active violation of human rights conventions to which we've been a signatory for decades, including violation of the rights of refugees, children, and Indigenous Australians in being locked up without charge. We've witnessed the repeal of the only decent laws made by Australia in relation to refugee rights in the 21st century, namely the Medevac legislation, which was passed by Federal Parliament in late 2018 and repealed in late 2019 by the Morrison government for absolutely no purpose and benefit other than to impose further pain on refugees that we have illegally detained for years. And just in case that isn't enough, we've witnessed the attempted subversion of the nation's human rights agencies, particularly the Human Rights Commissioner Gillian Triggs, in retaliation by the Liberal National Party government for her decision to conduct an inquiry into children in immigration detention. My apologies for all the red lettering here, but there is really nothing good to say about this multi-dimensional attack on the rights of all Australians. Dare I say, something is rotten in the state of Australia. It sounds like a parody more suited to the captions of the political cartoonists, but the fact is, we can now be sure that when rotten things go on in intelligence agencies or under the directions of now inordinately powerful ministers like the Minister for Home Affairs, Peter Dutton, these people do not have to account for those abuses. With each step towards secrecy and diminished human rights, we are moving closer by the year to living in an autocracy. You know, things are getting really bad when news organisations from the most conservative to the most progressive join up as they did in 2019 to launch a coordinated campaign of resistance and protest against secrecy laws in what they called the Right to Know campaign. Credible commentators now designate Australia as arguably the most secretive democracy in the Western world. And independent politicians have started asking, are we a free market democracy or Orwell's 1984? All up, Australia is not in a good state in 2020 in terms of the most basic rights that free and open countries are used to boasting of when comparing themselves to more autocratic or authoritarian nations. More insights into how serious this is becoming are provided in episode 4 of this series on the state of Australia. But the threat to our assumed democratic rights and systems is not just coming from above. We are threatening the effectiveness of our democracy ourselves by withdrawal from positive participation in it. So it's time to take a closer look at what we are doing to ourselves by that withdrawal. I'll concentrate on that in the next part of this episode, Issue 8, on declining participation in democracy. Australia's constitution gives us a representative democracy, but Australians aren't using this gift to its full potential. We're using it less and less as time passes. This is not just reflected in our declining rates of voter participation, although they are a concern. Turnout at the 2016 federal election for the House of Representatives was only 91%, the lowest turnout recorded since the introduction of compulsory voting in 1925. There was a slight bounce back in 2019, but still well more than 1 million enrolled voters failed to vote. This drop in voter turnout has run in parallel with a decline in satisfaction with our democracy. According to the Museum of Australian Democracy and the University of Canberra's research for the Democracy 2025 project, 86% of voters were satisfied in 2007 with Australia's democracy, but that figure dropped to 72% by 2010, where it plateaued for 3 years and then went into free fall from 2013, plummeting to 41% by 2018. Australia, it would seem, is part of a growing global trend of dissatisfaction with democracy. Pew Research and others have reported that satisfaction with democracy is tipping around the world. There are now more authoritarian regimes than full democracies. Some countries, of course, are culturally more comfortable with or more accustomed to authoritarian regimes. But this would be quite unusual for Australia, where our national character has usually been celebrated as a proud, self-governing democracy with all the freedoms that implies. Of course, if there is dissatisfaction with our democracy, this isn't necessarily synonymous with a desire to do away with it. It just means we're not happy with the way it's being used, and we would prefer it if our leaders in government, business, and the community used it better. Unfortunately, they're not using it better. As we can see in the 2019 Civicus International Monitor of Global Freedoms, Australia has recently been downgraded from an open society and democracy to a narrowed one. We are being given less freedoms to exercise within our democracy, and our trust in our institutions has dropped accordingly. Indeed, Australia isn't getting any good reports in independent monitoring of our strength as an open, free, democratic nation. The Edelman Trust Barometer, an international survey of trust in institutions for over 20 years, has reported survey results from Australia that show the general population of Australia has slipped into distrust of all our institutions, including government, business, NGOs, and the media. According to the Edelman Trust Barometer, we have retreated to placing trust mainly in our direct employer, the person in our public life that we can eyeball directly. As a result, in 2020, many Australians are withdrawing from a beneficial use of their democracy because they see their influence through the ballot box process is declining, and as yet they have no other way to rebalance shares of power between governments, businesses, institutions, and we the people. There is a way to efficiently rebalance those shares of power, but Australians haven't yet organised themselves to achieve this. That efficiency gain can be delivered by joining together to develop a plan for the nation's long-term future. Australian Community Futures Planning has been established to help Australians do that. But in 2020, they are still relying mostly on activism and protest. Fortunately, despite the recent assaults on democratic freedoms in Australia, they can and still do engage in activism, at least for now. Many are engaging in their democracy through activism, particularly on climate change, preservation of native forests and habitats, refugee rights, Indigenous disadvantage, and other human rights such as rights on same-sex marriage. But the rights of Australians to engage freely in protest and free expression of opinion are being eroded, and the gains being made by activism are slow work. It now takes an inordinately long time for progress to be made on things that should be simple, such as Indigenous rights, gay rights, women's rights, benefits for the disadvantaged, and of course, the environment. In this arrangement, our democracy is becoming very inefficient, which in turn is causing further withdrawal from participation. And this precisely at a time we need to increase our participation in our democracy if we want to keep it. Of course, most Australians would lay the problems with our democracy at the foot of politicians, and there's no doubt that politicians have a lot to answer for. But politics is not where democracy occurs. The reality is that democracy occurs when there is open participation by an educated, accurately informed populace. It doesn't occur at the ballot box, especially if there is electoral funding distortion and fake news. At the ballot box, we're doing something quite different. We are deliberately and quite sensibly giving away power for the sake of orderly decision-making. We give it to a tiny few who we hope will represent us in good faith and govern fairly for all, not just for themselves or the particular people who voted for them. Clearly, in 2020, though, we don't trust our politicians to do that. Our trust in them has been dropping. This is at least partly a result of the fact that we have given away power without telling those we've given it to what we would want them to do with that power. We haven't told them to what end it may be exercised. Their fall from grace and our drop in trust have arisen from the fact that we are missing a step in the process of democracy. The missing step is a community-driven, national integrated plan. This plan needs to come into being in two main parts. The first is an agreement on our ultimate destination for the long term. This is about the place we want the next generation to wake up in. It is not an agreement limited to the politicians' short-term political horizon. If we confine ourselves to the terms of what a politician may be willing to offer, we will never focus on what we really want. But if we lift our sights above the politician's horizon to what we want for our children, we are much more likely to agree on a preferred destination for the nation. The second part of this plan is simply a map of the routes we prefer to take to reach that destination and an understanding about the routes we prefer to avoid. This is the plan that must be built by Australians together if we want to rescue our democracy and all that it can offer us, and rescue the integrity and effectiveness of our electoral system of representative democracy at the same time. In injecting that plan into our democratic process, we are not undermining the electoral system, we're strengthening it, and doing so by simply switching the order in which we set up our system of power and power sharing. In the current order of our democratic process, the now dysfunctional order, the one without a national integrated plan, we start by electing a government and we keep our fingers crossed that they will plan in our best interests. Generally, national governments do not plan at all, and they certainly do not ask us about our preferences for the future. Once elected, they therefore run a legislative and policy program that does no more than govern well for some, not well for all. In the new order, we would inject an earlier step. We would first elect a plan, as it were, not at the ballot box, but in a process of meaningful and genuine community engagement. One we could be confident had produced a plan which was inclusive and in which we could each see a future for ourselves, alongside others, not to the exclusion of others. That would be a plan that acknowledged us in all our diversity and made a space for all Australians to realise their potential. It would not be binding on government, but it would be indicative of the nation's will and aspirations. It would function as guidance. With that in hand, we could then each vote freely as we saw fit, as usual. But this time, we would have sent a coherent message about our preference for use of the power we are conferring on these representatives. We would be telling them what we're trusting them with, rather than simply letting them interpret our will and call their victory a mandate for their narrower, short-term party political platforms. In this order, the plan we had pre-agreed would function as a means of judging the performance of those we elect and judging their credentials for re-election down the track. We could more easily judge their character and their real competency in relation to what matters most to us. The legislative and policy agenda that the elected politicians would then be able to implement would have a far greater chance of being an agenda that will ensure good governance for all, not just for some. Such a switch in the order of our democratic process may be regarded by some as idealistic or impracticable. The idea of getting people to agree on a plan for the future isn't going to be automatically the preference of skeptics. But it is simple and practical. And in fact, it is a process already in place in local government. Community strategic planning of this kind is already a legal requirement in most states of Australia and has been so for more than a decade. And many Australians find engagement with this process enjoyable. Regardless of whether integrated planning can be lifted from the local to the national level, the fact remains that if Australians wish to rescue their democracy from its current decline, they will need a way to move back into participation that is efficient for the time poor and the disempowered. While politicians are more likely to make democracy less efficient, we the people are the ones who can reverse the decline in the effectiveness of our democracy and escape the short-term self-interest of politics. As Australia's former chief scientist Ian Chubb said when he was asked in early 2020 to pick one essential vision for the 2020 decade, we the people have to take responsibility for the very nature of our country. It is too important to leave to a few. It requires all of us to be informed, to stand up and to take a stand, because we have to if we care. We, the people, all of us, can do this if we plan together for the longer term. Australians can plan together efficiently for the long term using national integrated planning and reporting. You can find out how at Australian Community Futures Planning. If you wish to make our democracy work more fairly and effectively for you and your family, visit us at www.austcfp.com.au. The next episode of The State of Australia in 2020 looks at 3 significant issues standing in the way of Australians who may wish to chart a better path to the future for their children within our democracy. These issues are the rise in unethical governance and the slow creep of more open corruption in Australia's political landscape, the growing fractiousness of our international relations, and the trends of mixed responsibility and irresponsibility in corporate Australia. Any plan for the future of Australia should include commitments to re-establish standards of best practice in ethics, international relations, and corporate responsibility if we expect to build a truly resilient society, environment, economy, and democracy. Australia Together is being developed by Australians to ensure we can re-establish those standards. You can become involved in developing Australia Together by visiting ACFP's website at www.austcfp.com.au and registering for updates. Thanks for watching this episode. For further episodes in this series on the state of Australia in 2020, visit ACFP at our website, or stay tuned for episode 4 on unethical governance, fractious international relations, and corporate responsibility in Australia. If you like this episode, please click like on the YouTube page and share the episode with your friends and subscribe to this channel.